Like all stories and history and narratives, the focus has to be held in sight in order to make it intelligible. There are so many things that affect every piece of history that it's impossible to explore each one and come to a conclusion as to its effect. So that's my problem here. I want to explain how my ancestors got from northeastern France to Frenchville, Pennsylvania in 1835. It's so I'm going to start 150 years before that event with the King of England and with Admiral William Penn Sr. The King's treasury was empty due to wars with France and other countries, and Admiral Penn was a part of the aristocracy and had money. So he loaned the King of England £16,000, which is equivalent of $3 or $4 million today. It was a large sum. Admiral Penn died then subsequently, and his son, William Penn Jr., wanted to settle the estate, but the king didn't have any money to do that. So they agreed that the debt would be cleared by the granting of about 50,000 square miles of wild property in central Pennsylvania. William Penn was a Quaker, and the Quakers were being persecuted in England at that time and being ejected. A lot of them went to Holland, but William Penn came to the United States to inspect his property and to transfer his life to this country. He helped establish Philadelphia and many other small towns in the region. One of them was Wilkes-Barre, about 150 miles northeast of Frenchville, where Frenchville is located. So he prospered and grew even richer. But he had two sons who inherited his property when he died. These two sons were not the honorable man that William Penn was. They were rascals. They were cheats and thieves and were smart, but they lost their grip. Events turned against them and went bankrupt. Somehow, a man by the name of Carthus, and a little town along the river about 7 miles from Frenchville, is named Carthus today. But nevertheless, bought the property from the bankrupt Penns. He tried to manufacture iron from the iron ore that he had located there at Carthus. And he was successful in manufacturing iron kettles and stoves and so forth. But the isolation and the shallow west branch of the Susquehanna prevented economical transportation of its products to a market. That river is only navigable during the spring freshets. The rest of the year it's very shallow and the rocks protrude through the top of the water, so moving barges or anything down the river most of the year is not possible. A man by the name of Keating bought the property from the bankrupt Carthus. William Keating was an interesting guy. He was an Englishman too, and part of the aristocracy, but he was a Catholic, and his family were Catholics. And during the reign of King Henry VIII, when the king wanted to divorce, I think it was Annie Boleyn, and the Pope wouldn't permit it, the king founded the Church of England and separated from Rome. And the Catholics that remained faithful to Rome were prosecuted. Family of Keating were forced to abandon their fortune and homes and flee to France to save their lives. But they had friends in France, in the capital there, Paris, and they gradually rebuilt their fortune and livelihood. But Keating joined the army, Napoleon's army, and he became a captain in the artillery, and he fought many battles until, of course, Napoleon was deposed in 1814, and Keating then was transferred to Haiti to settle the revolution of the slaves there on that island. But the slaves won, and Keating barely escaped with his life. He escaped on a ship that went to Philadelphia, and he landed there with less than $400 in his pocket. But during this time, of course, the French Revolution had caused many French to escape with their lives. The nobility were in danger of having their heads lopped off, as well as the king and queen. Many of them escaped to England and the United States. In Philadelphia, there were a fairly large population of these emigres that Kading was familiar with. They helped him, and he reestablished himself, regained his fortune through business and land transactions. Kading increased his holdings by purchasing about 120,000 acres located in a very deep wilderness among the pines. But the pine trees did present some serious problems for settlers. These monstrous trees were so close together that the tops formed a canopy, and the sunlight barely penetrated to the ground. So the underbrush was very sparse, and this region didn't support wild animals because of the lack of food for them. He realized that he had a vast fortune in timber there, consisting mostly of the world's most premier white pine stand, and of course many oaks and other valuable species. But as I mentioned earlier, the Indian tribes in the region had long considered that area of central Pennsylvania a dark land and haunted with spirit. They never did settle there. So as a result, there wasn't any population there. Kading determined to resolve his manpower shortage problem. So he conceived a plan to try to entice peasants of France to transplant to Frenchville. He hired a Polish man to go to France for this purpose. The ploy that he used to get the attention of the poor was a promise of 48 acres and a 12-acre bonus if they stayed for 5 years. When you think about the people that he was approaching, were not landowners and were in a position similar to my great-grandfather in the fact that he was the youngest man in the family and had not been eligible for inheritance of anything. The law of primogeniture in those days ensured that the oldest son was always the inheritor of the property, and that had a practical value, and it kept the properties from being chopped up into small inheritances that couldn't support anybody. But if you were one of the younger ones, it certainly wasn't a very sweet idea. My great-grandfather was the youngest one, and therefore I had to depend on weaving as a source of income. And of course, weavers were at the bottom of the pit as far as income and social standing were concerned, and were the victims of the people who supplied the wool for weaving and who also bought the finished goods. And a weaver, of course, was the guy that had to use a loom to weave the material, and that loom was also supplied by the supplier of the wool. The women in the house did the cleaning and carding of the raw wool that came in large sacks. And so it was a very precarious living, and the prices of the wool that was sold and the price of finished goods bought back was also established by the supplier of the wool. So the weaver had no control over his fate whatsoever and depended on degree of avarice of the wool supplier. So the opportunity for owning property, which is inherent in the bones of every peasant, certainly sounded sweet. The salesman was successful in procuring the assent enough to do the job that Mr. Kading had sent him for. During my research for this book, I found the names and the villages of many of the local people there in Frenchville. They came from the various villages in the region, and so I could trace the path that this salesman traveled from village to village. He'd persuade one or two from this village and maybe one from the next one and so forth, so you could see where he went to do his recruiting. He must have spent 4 or 5 years there in France, so doing this work. It must have been an uphill climb to persuade these medieval minds to make such a drastic step. He must have been a slick-talking used wagon salesman. It must have been a terrible decision to have to make, though, because even though they lived in poverty there, it was home and familiar to them. And the idea of going to a land many, many thousands of miles away, knowing that they would never return, had to be a very, very difficult decision. In fact, my great grandfather's half-brother, Pierre, decided to stay there. A story that's not well confirmed, however, it must have some basis in fact because it's been repeated in my ears when I was a kid several times that great-grandfather went back to France in later years, and as he was walking toward his old house there in Pierrefittes, he found that his brother was living in one of the shacks in the village. When he went to see it, his brother wouldn't open the door because he thought that great-grandpa was a beggar. But upon insistence of the knocking, he did open the door, and of course both were old men by that time, but they recognized each other and apparently shed many tears in reconciliation of the long separation. Pierre was absolutely living in dire, poverty-stricken situation. Had he gone to Frenchville with his half-brother, he certainly would have done better than what he did by staying. But they did make the decision. It's not too difficult to imagine the conversations and the consternation. They got possession of their passport. The two older women that came with them, his mother and aunt, women in their 60s, widows that couldn't be left behind, or didn't want to be left behind. But they didn't want to go to America either, I would suspect. So I suppose they disposed of their few belongings, because I didn't have very many real properties. And, of course, they were on foot. I don't know how they got from Rougeux to Paris, but that's a long 300-mile trip. And that was well before trains and any vehicular transportation other than horse and wagon. And I'm certain that they don't own a horse or a wagon. So they had to carry their clothing and their necessities of life. And certainly in those days, restaurants were far too expensive for them. They couldn't even pay for their passport application. And that's why they were in the indigent file. And so I don't know how they managed to eat and the shelter that they needed over that long trip. Walking any distance of that nature would have taken several weeks at minimum. If they could manage 10 miles a day, that would be a month's travel, basically. So it's beyond me how they did that. There's no documentation on how they covered that long distance, but I suspect that they walked it. And of course, they had those two little children, two little baby girls, but then they had to arrive at the shipping dock, the berth of the ship that was going to take them to America. And in those days, they only ran 2 round trips a year, and the schedule was certainly not fixed firmly upon their departure and arrival. Certainly the arrival and departure dates were very nebulous because it would take anywhere from 2 to 3 months to cross the Atlantic, depending on the weather and the winds and so forth. So they had to arrive at Le Havre well ahead of time to be sure that they didn't miss a ship. I have no idea how they overcame those difficulties. They also had to carry their own food on board for the 2 to 3 month trip. Who financed that? It must have been Mr. Kading, because they certainly couldn't do it. In my research about the shipping schedules of that period, it wasn't until the mid-1840s until they had a regular schedule. Also found a story of the Cistercian monks and their first trip over here in about 1845. They brought their own oven on board ship and baked bread for their survival, and they shared that with the other passengers on board. And then upon their arrival in Philadelphia, they faced another daunting challenge, and that was the 200-mile walk over the Allegheny Mountains to Frenchville. I have information that an order of priests, and I don't recall the name anymore, but I found somewhere an order of priests met them there and nourished them back to reasonable health, because they certainly would have deteriorated in their physical abilities, being cramped in a tiny little wooden ship that is endlessly rocking and moving with the waves. Of course, they had to sleep down below decks. Those old ships leak constantly, and bunk rooms, or the place where they stayed below decks, was undoubtedly damp and wet. The living conditions were really poor on those boats. Must have been a horrible trip. So anyway, they endured. When they arrived at Philadelphia, either in the fall, if they took the springtime vessel, or if they took the fall trip, they would have arrived sometime in the winter weather. So they had to be supported when they arrived with food and shelter and tools to do the necessary gardening and tree cutting and so forth. They didn't have any of those tools where they came from, and they certainly couldn't have carried them on their backs along with the two children and their clothing and living necessities. I don't know how the people traveled from Philadelphia to Frenchville other than walking. There was a road toward Pittsburgh, and wagoners could be hired to haul your goods, but it was pretty expensive, and it certainly wasn't on the list of options for our people. But I know for a fact that they walked. So many accounts that I personally have that testify to that, and my father told me that too. So I don't have any doubt that they walked the 200 miles across those rugged mountains. It must have been a grueling trip carrying two little children, one probably a born or recently born, my grandfather, and the two older women, one whom barely lived to make the trip and died that very year that they arrived. Of course, great-grandpa's wife, Margaret, my great-grandmother, died in 1891. She lived to be 90. My father was born in 1886, and so he would have been 4 or 5 years old when his grandmother died. He told me that he saw Margaret a couple of times that he remembered. She was an old woman sitting on a chair near the kitchen stove where it was warm, and she had a blanket over her shoulders. And he told me he thought she was pretty grouchy. I don't know how accurate his analysis of her demeanor was, but I suspect as a 4 or 5 year old, he had a pretty good nose for the situation. There were a lot of people in that group that were probably not able to carry a substantial load, but those two children had to be carried. The Alleghenies are a steep mountain and difficult terrain to travel and walk. When great-grandpa applied for the passport, the application shows that, of course, his name, John Baptiste, his wife, Mary Morel, his mother, Catherine Ageron, and his aunt, Marguerite Ageron, and 2 infants. I have information from France that those 2 infants were girls, and I have their names. The arrival of my great-grandfather and his family was definitely confirmed by the tombstone of Margaret Ageron, one of the passport applicants, who died in September 1835. And that my grandfather's birthday was June 25th, 1835. That the passport application was dated March 24th, 1834. And that there were only 2 sailings each year, one in the spring and one in the fall. And the lack of information about the youngest girl that had been on the passport application, but the knowledge that they now had a son, which they didn't have March 24th, 1834, I couldn't fit anything together, because I know the names of the 2 girls that were on the passport application. And I know that only one is in any records in the Clearfield Courthouse, the oldest one. So somewhere along here, it appears that the youngest girl probably died, and certainly John was born. Now, where was John born? He couldn't have been born in France, because we know that he was born in June of 1835, and that they certainly were in Frenchville by September 1835. The tombstone reads, Margaret Agereau, born in Pierrefitte, Haute-Marne, France, in 1768. Died in Frenchville, 14th of September, 1835. Aged 65 years. I think a reasonable conclusion can be made that he very probably was born on the water or immediately upon their arrival in Frenchville. But that would have meant that his mother would have had to carry him from Philadelphia to Frenchville at a grossly pregnant stage in his conception. And it's difficult to believe that she could have tolerated that 200-mile walk over the mountains. But there again, they were tough old people, and it's certainly possible. It's also possible he could have been born in Philadelphia immediately upon her arrival, but then she'd have had to carry him as a newborn in her delivered condition, and that may have even been more difficult for her. But nevertheless, it certainly was a difficult time for all of them. Words really can't express the appreciation of the troubles and turmoil that they had, and that the benefits that accrued to us as a result of their sacrifice. Dad told me that his father told him that the lower eastern part of the state from the higher mountainous region of Frenchville, it must have been a great disappointment to arrive at this desolate, densely forested ground after traversing through the open plains of the lower part of the state that were already occupied by Quakers from the early days of William Penn. But we know that they arrived in Frenchville without a penny and without any tools or anything, so it's obvious that they had to be supported until they could raise their own crops anyway, and that was going to be a good year before they could do that, based on the seasons that they arrived and the lack of cleared land. The land that they bought was covered with these tremendous trees, and they had to scratch between the trees, and the trees formed a canopy that prevented sunlight from reaching the ground, according to some reliable written documentation by people who lived in that area and explored in the early days. So they girdled the trees and got some sunlight after the trees died, but that took a year. I don't know how they survived and what shelter they were given, because they had no axe or anything, and they weren't experienced in woodsmanship. It's apparently not recorded anywhere how much Great-Grandpa paid for the 48 acres that he got from the salesman in France. He may not have paid anything. It's unknown at this time, but I do know that he was promised another 12 acres if he stayed on the property for a given amount of time. And I thought it was 5 years, but I noticed in the tax rolls for Cullington Township in 1837 that the size of his farm increased from 48 acres to 60 acres. And that was just after 2 years from the time of his arrival there. So he may have been given that extra land bonus as it was. It's interesting to note that the first 48 were valued at $1 an acre. Then after he increased the amount to 60 acres, the value went up to $1.50. And so even then they weren't free from taxes, but that's certainly a vast increase in his fortunes from what he had in France, which was a zero value because he was renting a hut, and he was in debt to the wool manufacturers for the loom that he leased or used. Certainly paid for the use of it, and so his fortune steadily improved over the years. From a hut in France, which was grass thatched roof, to a log cabin in Frenchville. The location of the original log house was in front of the house that was constructed during the Civil War era, a two-story schoolwork house that was vastly improved over the log house. And of course the construction of the outbuildings that gradually grew to a total of 11 by the turn of the century would certainly indicate that he was living a typically prosperous farm life of that era. And of course this income was generated from the lumbering activities that he had. Not only did he clear about 300 acres of property that he owned in the years before he died, but he bought and sold other properties during his lifetime. And that's evidenced by the deeds that I found in the Clearfield County Courthouse. What he'd do is buy a tract of land and cut the timber and then sell the land. He prospered. Both great-grandpa and grandpa did well financially during their lives. Certainly vastly superior to what they would have experienced and what great-grandpa's brother experienced in France during that same time frame. And about the time that he got his bonus acreage, he applied for citizenship, as this document shows. During the time I was researching for the long journey, I had contacted every Rougian person I thought could give me some information, and over a period of quite a few years, at least a decade, I found a Rougeux in California, a Dr. Rougeux. He told me that his brother had some information that I might be interested in, so I called him, and he had information he had gotten from his father. His father was a brother of my grandfather, and he had inherited this box of documents. He wasn't married, and he told me that he had nobody to give those to, so if I wanted this box of stuff, he'd be glad to send it to me. Needless to say, I was overjoyed to get that kind of stuff. So I sent the box, and there wasn't a lot in there that I really wanted to use because it pertained to his grandfather. But the one piece of paper that was in, I'd like to say a few words about the geological formation. Apparently about 450 million years ago, there was a large continent called Pangaea, situated where Africa is now located. Large pieces of that continent split off. Some went to South America and formed the eastern edge of that continent. Some went to Ireland and formed part of that region. And a large piece came against what was the eastern coast of the United States then. And the force of this large mass colliding with the American plate upheaved the mountains that we now know as the Alleghenies. Those mountains apparently, according to some geologists, were once the highest mountains in the world. But over the 450 million years of erosion, you can see that there's a great reduction in those heights. But they're still pretty rugged. There are many, many steep mountainsides and deep valleys. And the rivers are smaller creeks that separate them. Just north of Frenchville, there's a deep bridge and a mountain called the Heimer Mountain. About 30 years ago, some geologists found a skeleton of a fish that exists in Africa, and the soil is different too. There's a separation in the types of soil that further proves that the translation of that huge piece of soil actually happened. Geological evacuations during the last 30 or 40 years have unearthed numerous sites of ancient people who lived in the region as long as 14,000 years ago. Clovis arrowheads have been located in the residue of the Ice Age that ended around 14,000 years ago along the Susquehanna River and in Philadelphia and various locations in the region. So it's well known that the area was populated by Native Americans as much as 14,000 years ago. This picture is typical of the back roads surrounding Frenchville. This particular road is north of the village. It was taken on a day when my cousin Tom and I took a drive back through there while I was back home visiting during one of my vacations. It's a very sparsely settled region, and it's into the region that the Indians called the Dark Country, and they thought it was haunted, and they didn't even settle there. But the terrain is so rough and isolated that the only settlements back there are campers built numerous small, little temporary housing that they use during the hunting seasons. It's game filled with all kinds of game, including elk now that they transported from Wyoming 30 or 40 years ago, and they've prospered as they did originally. And of course there are a lot of coyotes and wild turkey. It's part of an enormous state game reserve that incorporates a large portion of that dark country that the Indians avoided. That was all covered with huge timber cut in the latter half of the 1800s. Small railroads were built through the area to transport the logs to the sawmills, and of course a lot of them were floated down the larger streams and rivulets that exist in that country. I don't know how those poor men survived that effort. First of all, the slopes in some places are really difficult to even hang on to. You can't stand very easily on the angle of the slopes. But that is not nearly as bad as the pestilence of the flies and the insects that abound in that region. There's a blue colored fly. It's a small one. They come in swarms and they're attracted by the odor of humans, particularly sweat. In fact, the day that my cousin and I were back there, we had to cut that short because of the attack by so many of these stinging little flies. I'm going to end this one here and we'll go to the next one.